Hi, I'm Marc Lynch. I'm the director of the Project on Middle East Political Science in the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of conversations with leading scholars. With me today is John Entelis of Fordham University and the president of the American Institute for Maghreb Studies. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, where I want to start is that for many of us, we begin thinking about Tunisia, we begin thinking about the Maghreb in December of 2010. And you're in a position to have a much longer view of political change and political development in the region. And I was hoping maybe you could just reflect a little bit on your kind of longer perspective on where Tunisia is, where the Maghreb as a whole is, where it might be going.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the reasons that I moved towards North Africa from the Middle East, which was where I began my work in Egypt and in Lebanon, and I did my dissertation, was in part to try to escape from some of both the stereotype and essentializing of the Middle East that occurred in the study of the Middle East itself, and the difficulty to do what I thought was really good kind of comparative political work where one could go just beyond descriptive analysis or idiosyncratic discussion of countries. And North Africa really did present itself as one of the most logical laboratories for this kind of work when you looked at Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, each obviously sharing a great deal of historical commonality in language and religion and so forth, but also very different politically. And when I started my work, the most influential studies in North Africa were those that were looked at Tunisia, Clem Henry among those, for example, that saw Tunisia as one of the successful cases of modernization and westernization at a time when Egypt under Nasser particularly was viewed as the real model of what Arab nationalism and Arab socialism. And that itself sort of provoked interest on my part to understand what is it about Tunisia, what is it about North Africa that might be different. And since it had been pretty much neglected in the overall study of the Middle East, and to what extent was this confidence about its democratization and westernization and modernization was valid empirically that I needed to discover. So my first work was in Tunisia under a Social Science Research Council grant to do an attitudinal survey of university students who I viewed as a kind of incipient elites and the degree to which they would or would not sustain and maintain and advance the Bourguibist vision of Tunisia, pro-Western, secular, modern, francophone, bilingual, and so forth, or whether or not this was kind of an artificial elitist construct that would disappear with Bourguiba. And it was back in 1972, and my survey results were fascinating in the extent to which 40, 50 years later, one sees the results of that survey, which had a strong emphasis on Islam, a strong emphasis on the Arab identity, a strong emphasis on an anti-Israel position, which was not Bourguiba, and so forth. So anyway, that was the introduction. Understandably, from a political science point of view, Algeria had always fascinated people, understandably because of its historical and revolutionary past. But one that was very difficult to access, and in English there wasn't that much material, as I'm sure you're familiar. So I applied for a Fulbright to go and teach for a year in the middle of the 1970s. And that year, that whole year, we had just reestablished diplomatic relations, as you may recall, that had been severed after the Six-Day War. And they weren't reestablished until 1976 because you couldn't have a Fulbright with a country that we didn't have diplomatic relations with. So I was among the first Fulbright professors to teach at the University of Algiers. But that opportunity, opened up my eyes in ways that, the literature had totally escaped. There had been people like Bill Quant, who had done work, the Ottoways had done work, the Savage War of Peace historically and so forth. But this really gave me an opportunity to get an understanding of the attempts at sort of state building via a socialist model, revolutionary model, and so on. But I clearly came away from was that a year was barely sufficient enough to really get a handle on what this country, and the comparison with Tunisia was enormous. I then subsequently applied for another Fulbright to Rabat, where I spent another year teaching at the university there. And again, the opportunity to spend a year showed me and allowed me to make the comparisons between the other two. And I came to realize what a totally different system this is. So from multiple levels, at one, I think, theoretical level in comparative politics, these were absolutely fascinating cases in which you did share a number of similar characteristics, but in which important differences existed in political outcomes and trying to determine what they were. But also, there was a certain stability about it, so therefore you were not looking at a moving target, which, had made it interesting. At the end of the day, of course, my view was, having, looked at all three of them, was whether or not they were a monarchy, whether or not there was a revolutionary republic or a more quasi-democratic republic, that they were all essentially authoritarian regimes whose political systems was essentially governed by a small elite and so on. So I remain pretty pessimistic about the ability for them to maintain their hold on power in the various mechanisms that they used to do so. Algeria with oil, Bourguiba with kind of advancing a middle class bourgeois agenda, and the king manipulating as much as he could with the symbols. So that was all the prelude to what ultimately then exploded.
Well, so then fast forward to the last couple of years.
Yeah.
What has surprised you, if anything?
Well, as you know, and most people never expected Tunisia to be the first case for the reasons we've indicated, that it seemed to be the one the most advanced, the most pro-Western, the most stable. And I mean, historically, of the three countries, this is a country that has least violence in its history, and that's before the colonial period, during the colonial period, after the colonial period. So all these elements of its apparent institutionalization, its apparent stability, its lack of violent culture and history, seemed not the place where it would happen. It wasn't that the analyses didn't predict that it should happen, it just wasn't clear how it was going to happen, which led a lot of people, of course, to argue about the robust authoritarianism of the state. But by the time it collapsed, I mean, all of us had pretty much, identified the sort of social and economic fault lines that were expanding almost, monthly, and how was the regime able to maintain itself? And it was impossible to predict what catalyst would ultimately force it all to come down. But on the other hand, not only was this a surprise about it being the first, but the manner in which it has proceeded, as chaotic as it may appear in many circles, I think is also consistent with its historical past and gives me confidence that because of the high level of education, exposure to, and level of political knowledge and so on, gives me confidence that whatever may be the current differences, which are understandable in light of the post-revolutionary situation, that ultimately they will come to some kind of consensus that will be reflected in the institutions that are now being created with the Constitution first.
I mean, you've generally been more optimistic about Tunisia than most people, and is that why you think that there's this formula for consensus?
I think it's there. I think people are a bit premature in making judgments, viewing it on a kind of day-by-day basis, which is understandable, and also vis-a-vis its current past, where there wasn't this kind of violence, and of course the emergence of kind of extremist Islamic, activity on the part of Salafists and others has shocked some people. On the other hand, I think the manner in which these differences are being negotiated and handled gives one hope that it'll be through institutions and not through violence. Unlike what's happening in Egypt and elsewhere, that makes me optimistic. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, it's only been a couple of years, and my long-term view is that it'll work out.
What about Algeria?
Yeah.
I mean, Algeria it really is one of the most interesting of these cases.
Absolutely.
And we were talking earlier today about it's only 20 years ago, 10 years ago, that you had a civil war
Absolutely.
that killed 100,000,
200,000,
people.
absolutely.
So how do you read what's happening in Algeria right now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Algeria is, I still think, has always remained the most interesting, the most important, the most fascinating, and but the most opaque, the most difficult one to understand. But I think for those of us who have studied Algeria can understand why the revolution hasn't taken place there yet, at least, and part of it has to do with the civil war, the memory of that civil war. Part of it has to do with oil, of course, a huge $200 billion sovereign wealth fund that it has accumulated. They have no foreign debt, so they have a socio-economic incentive that allows them to, turn on and off when the system requires it. The role of the military is absolutely essential. There's the term used, le pouvoir. I call it the military-industrial complex, with absolute determination that the state will not collapse while a lot of other kind of activity can take place, including, as I've mentioned, demonstrations, strikes.
Well, but that's the thing, is that there actually has been persistent, royal, and ongoing protest.
Absolutely.
Why doesn't this kind of snowball in the way that we saw in some other countries?
Well, I think part of it is the fact that it has been going on for as long as it has passed. I mean, there is. It has served the regime well because it serves to sort of, take the pressure off when necessary. So the pot is boiling, you pick up the lid, and what's being released? Well, all these demonstrations, all these strikes, and these aren't recent, and they're not just, infrequent. I mean, and they're not localized. They're nationwide, they're ongoing, they're all sectors. And I think it serves, whether it's intentional or not, the state's purpose of not allowing the pressures to build up to such a point where then the state has to be the target for the protesters.
So Algeria's kind of ongoing low-level protest is actually more stabilizing than Tunisia's total repression of any.
It seems, I mean, very, very clearly. I mean, when you add these other dimensions, I mean, another thing that people don't take into account is that the size of the country. I think geography matters. The regional character of the country. It's very difficult to create a kind of uniform, mobilizable constituency the way you have in Tunisia or in Egypt because of the diversity of the country. I mean, this is an enormously, if you're in Tlemcen in the west as opposed to Constantine in the east, I mean, you have almost two different societies and so on. So you add, the social, ethnic, historical character of the country, the oil factor, the army factor, the civil war factor, the consistent demonstration factor, and then, of course, as has been mentioned many times, the demonstration effect of what they were learning from the experiences that have taken place in the region. And the result is, I think, is one where the revolution hasn't taken place, but a condition of continuous pressure on the system itself to try to resolve the kinds of social, economic, political issues that people make on the system. And so it's a state and a society in crisis, though it's not yet to the point where it's going to lead to a revolution.
And then briefly in Morocco, it sounds, from what you said before, it sounds like you don't think that the monarchy conveys any special status that is going to protect it. Those who study Morocco argue between the glass half full, half empty, and it goes back and forth. And there was a great deal of optimism, obviously, when Hassan died, whose political record was quite controversial, to say the least. And Mohammed VI came to power, and he was viewed as, the king of the poor, and he had this kind of popular image. That has long disappeared. And he himself, individually, and it's very evident in a number of years, has taken a very kind of passive approach towards governance, and it's not clear, who's actually making decisions. But I mean, the country has major problems, as you know. There's enormous social inequalities. This is a country that remains fundamentally poor. Forbes publishes annually the 15 wealthiest monarchs in the world, and the king is the 7th or 8th. But the country is one of the poorest in the world. So one can identify the literacy problem, the inequality problem, the broader economic problem because of the dependence on agriculture and so on and so forth. And I think this Morocco, even more than Algeria, is much more vulnerable, I think, to an overthrow. And the question and the element that has always remained uncertain and going back for 30 years is the role of the army. At one point in time, it
almost assassinated the king, made 2 efforts to do this. Then, of course, he sent him down to the Western Sahara, which explains why that issue is what it is. It's directly resulting from this attempt to assassinate him. That issue has exhausted itself. What is the position of the military? They clearly have a capacity to either defend it or overthrow the regime. We don't quite know where they stand on this. I think at this point, they find it in their interest to support the monarchy, and this is key. On the other hand, he's been very clever, as we know. He's been very preemptive in the way he's responded to challenges, as in the last instance, and immediately amended the constitution, allowed an Islamic party to have, the prime minister to come from the party because they had the greatest number of seats in the parliamentary elections, and so on and so forth. So I mean, has he exhausted those sort of, symbolic and political mechanisms that have helped him stay in power? Or do they still have a certain value and can be sustained over time? I'm pessimistic because also the demonstration effect, what's going on in the world and what's going on in the region, puts a lot of pressure on the monarchy, and monarchies by themselves, absolute monarchies, whether it's in Jordan or Morocco, 2 non-oil producing states, I think find themselves in a very defensive position.
Let me ask you one last question.
Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned demonstration effect several times, and I think one of the things which was so striking about the Arab Spring is that what happens in Tunisia resonates in Yemen. And clearly there's been a lot of demonstration effects and interaction in that period. And yet from much of what you're saying suggests that actually North Africa is evolving in its own direction. Yeah. And so where do you see that going? Do you see kind of a unique Maghrebi identity and its own regional politics forming? Or do you see it as kind of forever part of the Arab world in all the familiar ways?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the issues or areas that for those of us who study North Africa have always commented on is the degree to which there's a societal harmony in a way, that is Tunisian, Algerians, and Moroccans as individuals and as people, as opposed to their governments, which are the deciders and have blocked the ability, for example, to create a unified North Africa under there's an African, what's called the Ummah, the Union Maghribian Arab, which is the 5 North African states, which has gone nowhere, even though it came into existence in 1989. But part of it remains at the level of the elites. Now, the optimism lies in what the issue has always been, that given the governance structures, authoritarian for so long, and the determination of the integration as a function of those governing structures. Now that democracy has come to Tunisia, the argument, and possibly Libya, because that's another member of the Ummah, to what extent will political changes ultimately political changes, enable North Africa to assume what many people have long wanted it to assume, a legitimate independent presence, both economically, politically, and regionally, as in North Africa itself, as it relates to Europe and as it relates to the Middle East. We're not there yet. The Western Sahara conflict remains the case, and Morocco and Algeria still are.
But you think we're closer to a Mediterranean, kind of a Euro-Med identity than we ever were?
Well, I mean, there are many institutions, as you know, and conferences and organizations in which the Euro-Mediterranean dialogues and exchanges take place, and trade, of course, is still overwhelmingly between North Africa and Europe than it is between North Africa and
migrant labor flows.
And all the everything. Rest. I mean, the trade, or even if you look at just simple things like commercial air travel. If you want to go between Rabat and Tunis, compared to, let's say, Rabat and Paris. I mean, this all makes it very clear that the Euro-North African relationship is still enormously important. But I think ultimately, especially in a highly competitive globalized economy, they've got to begin to maximize the resources, both human and material, within the region that unification or a more regional harmonious relationship would make possible. And that's only possible, I would argue, once you have the political changes that are taking place as they are in Libya and Tunisia, if they begin to take place. And Mauritania, more or less, believe it or not. I mean, it falls in between. And I think the harmonization there will make that kind of regionalism possible, which will be to the benefit of the region as a whole. And I think then they can stand up more proudly and independently, not only as a region, but then vis-a-vis the Middle East, as well as in Europe.
Well, great. Thank you. John Entelis,
Marc.
Fordham University. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Marc. Appreciate it.